When Ethan's golden boy brother Jake steals $20,000 from his savings, he thinks the betrayal ends there. But as Ethan digs deeper, he uncovers a web of lies, debts, and manipulation far worse than he imagined. Refusing to let Jake get away with it, Ethan seeks justice, exposing his brother's schemes and watching Jake's perfect world crumble. Just as Ethan believes he's free of Jake's chaos, a desperate plea for help drags him back into a life-or-death situation. But when the truth comes to light, Ethan discovers the ultimate betrayal, a shocking twist that forces him to make a choice that will forever change their relationship. How far would you go to teach family a lesson about loyalty and trust? I always thought family was sacred. Growing up, it was just my brother Jake and me against the world. Our parents worked long hours, leaving us to fend for ourselves most of the time. Jake was older by 3 years, and to me, he was larger than life, my hero. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, helped me sneak cookies before dinner, and even stood up to a school bully when I was too scared to fight back. I idolized him, and he knew it. Jake, though, was different. He had that effortless charm, the kind of charisma that made people gravitate toward him. Teachers gave him the benefit of the doubt, friends followed him without question, and even when he screwed up, our parents would let it slide. Boys will be boys, they'd say with a laugh. It didn't bother me at the time. Jake was everything I wasn't: bold, confident, fearless. I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the kid who always did his homework and followed the rules. Jake was my polar opposite, but we balanced each other out. At least, that's what I used to believe. As we got older, our paths diverged. I worked hard in school, got into a decent college, and landed a steady job in tech right after graduation. Jake? Not so much. He dropped out of community college after 1 semester, claiming it wasn't his thing. He bounced from job to job, rarely lasting more than a few months. I never judged him for it, life isn't a race, after all, but I couldn't help noticing how his carefree attitude started to feel more like recklessness. Still, he was my brother, and I told myself he'd figure it out eventually. When I got my first real paycheck, I was so excited I called Jake to celebrate. "Let's grab dinner," I told him. My treat. We went to this steakhouse downtown, and I ordered the most expensive thing on the menu just because I could. Jake was impressed, or maybe just surprised. "Look at you," he said, clinking his beer glass against mine. "Big shot now, huh?" I laughed it off, but part of me was proud. For the first time, I felt like I had something to offer. After that, it became a tradition. Whenever I hit a milestone, a promotion, a bonus, even just a good month at work, I'd take Jake out to celebrate. He'd always joke about how I was living the dream, but deep down, I knew he was struggling. His car was always breaking down, his phone screen was cracked, and he never seemed to have any money. But Jake being Jake, he laughed it off like it didn't bother him. Then came the first time he asked me for help. "Ethan, man, I hate to even ask," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "But I'm in a bit of a bind." I didn't even hesitate. "What do you need?" He explained that he was behind on rent and about to get evicted. "Just $5,000, he said. "I'll pay you back as soon as I can." You know, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. It was a lot of money, but I had it. I'd been saving aggressively, putting away every spare cent to build a safety net. Helping Jake felt like the right thing to do. "You don't have to pay me back," I told him. "Just get back on your feet." He looked so relieved I almost felt guilty for making him ask. "Thanks, man," he said, gripping my shoulder. "I won't forget this." But he did. Weeks turned into months, and every time I brought it up, Jake had a new excuse. "I'm waiting on a job offer," he'd say. Or, "I had to fix my car first, it's been a nightmare." I tried to be patient, but the more time passed, the more I realized I'd probably never see that money again. Still, I let it go. He was my brother. Family helps each other out, right? The breaking point came a year later. By then, I'd moved into a modest condo I'd worked hard to buy, and I was finally starting to feel secure. My career was stable, my savings were growing, and for the first time, I felt like all my sacrifices were paying off. One morning, I logged into my investment account to check on my stocks. I'd been learning about trading and had even started making small profits. But when I opened the account, I froze. The balance was wrong. At first, I thought it was a glitch. My account showed $20,000 missing, nearly everything I'd saved. Panic set in as I frantically checked my transaction history. That's when I saw it. A transfer had been made to an account under Jake's name. My stomach dropped. This had to be a mistake. There was no way Jake would do something like this. I called the bank to confirm, hoping they'd tell me it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. They explained that the transfer had been authorized using my login credentials I'd shared with Jake months ago, when he'd asked me to show him how to invest. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My own brother had stolen from me. That night, I drove to Jake's place. I didn't call ahead, I didn't trust myself to keep calm if I did. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me, but not guilty. "What's up, man?" he asked casually, like nothing was wrong. I held up my phone, showing him the transaction. "Care to explain this?" His expression didn't change. He didn't even flinch. "Oh, that," he said, shrugging. "Look, I was gonna tell you. You stole $20,000 from me." I yelled, cutting him off. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "How could you do this, Jake? After everything I've done for you?" He had the audacity to roll his eyes. "Don't be so dramatic, Ethan. You've got plenty of money, you won't even miss it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's not the point. That money was mine. Do you have any idea how hard I worked for it?" Jake sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "Relax. I needed it more than you did. You're always talking about how well you're doing, what's the big deal?" The big deal? The big deal was that my own brother had betrayed me and didn't even care. I left that night without another word. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding. I didn't know what hurt more, the theft or the fact that Jake felt entitled to what I'd earned. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to figure out what to do. A part of me wanted to let it go, to chalk it up as a lesson learned and move on. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Jake didn't just take my money, he took my trust. And that wasn't something I could forgive. That's when I decided, if Jake thought he could get away with this, he was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me, not anymore. I don't know what it was exactly, the rage, the hurt, or the sheer audacity of Jake's actions, but something inside me snapped. I wasn't the same person I was when I handed him that $5,000 a year ago. Back then, I thought helping him was the right thing to do because family always comes first. But now I saw him for what he really was, a selfish, entitled liar who thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. I needed a plan. The first thing I did was file a police report. It wasn't an easy decision. Jake was my brother, and calling the cops on him felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. But he'd crossed the line first. I told myself it wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting myself. If I didn't report the theft, the bank wouldn't reimburse me. And as much as I wanted my money back, I also wanted Jake to understand that he couldn't just take from me and walk away. The officer who took my statement was professional but skeptical. "You're sure it was your brother?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I showed him the evidence, screenshots of the transaction, emails from the bank, even the login history showing that my account had been accessed from Jake's IP address. The officer nodded slowly. "We'll look into it," he said, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled about pursuing a case of sibling-on-sibling crime. Next, I called the bank and gave them a copy of the police report. They froze my account immediately and launched their own investigation. It was humiliating having to explain how I'd been careless enough to let someone steal my credentials, but I swallowed my pride. I wasn't going to let Jake's actions ruin me financially. While the wheels of bureaucracy turned, I started working on my own plan to make Jake pay, not just in the legal sense, but personally. I remembered how Jake had once bragged about his financial system, which mostly involved juggling credit cards and dodging collectors. He thought he was clever, but I knew the truth: he was drowning in debt. And now, thanks to his stupidity, I had access to all his accounts. Months ago, when I'd been trying to help him get his life together, Jake had given me the passwords to his email, his bank accounts, and even his credit card portals. He'd been too lazy to manage them himself and figured I'd handle the hard work for him. At the time, I'd been happy to help. Now, I saw it as an opportunity. I logged into his accounts and was immediately greeted by a mess. He had 3 maxed-out credit cards, a payday loan with a sky-high interest rate, and several unpaid bills that had gone to collections. On top of that, he owed a few thousand to a shady online gambling site. It was worse than I thought, but it gave me an idea. I started small. Using the access Jake had so generously given me, I canceled all his automatic payments. His utilities, his car insurance, even his phone bill, everything got shut off within a week. I wanted him to feel the pressure, to understand what it was like to lose control. It didn't take long for the consequences to hit. Jake called me a few days later, sounding frantic. "Hey, Ethan, you got a minute? Something weird's going on with my accounts." I played dumb. "What do you mean?" "My car insurance got cancelled, and my landlord says my rent payment bounced." "I don't get it, I had money in there." I suppressed a smile. "That sucks, man. You should call your bank. Maybe there's an issue on their end." "Yeah, maybe," he muttered. He sounded distracted, like he was already running through worst-case scenarios in his head. Good. Over the next few weeks, I kept the pressure on. I didn't just stop his payments, I redirected them. Using his credit card portals, I submitted random payments to his smallest accounts, leaving his larger debts untouched. It was just enough to confuse his creditors without actually improving his situation. And when his gambling site started threatening legal action for unpaid bets, I made sure to forward the emails to his personal account. I wanted him to see how fast his world was unraveling. But I wasn't done yet. The real turning point came when I decided to take things public. Jake had always been the golden child in our family, the one our parents adored no matter what. They thought he was charming and carefree, the life of every party. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the debts, the lies, or the fact that he'd stolen $20,000 from his own brother. It was time they found out. One Sunday afternoon, I invited my parents over to my condo for lunch. I told them I had something important to talk about, and they assumed it was about work or maybe a new relationship. They had no idea what was coming. Over coffee, I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder I'd been compiling. It was a digital dossier of Jake's misdeeds, screenshots of his gambling debts, bank statements showing his overdue payments, and, of course, the evidence of the $20,000 transfer. "What's this?" my dad asked, frowning as I clicked through the files. "It's Jake's mess," I said, my voice cold. "He stole $20,000 from me, and this is what he's been doing with it." My mom gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "That can't be true," she whispered. "Jake wouldn't, he wouldn't do that to you." I stared at her, unblinking. "He did. And he doesn't even feel bad about it." My dad leaned forward, his face dark with anger. "When did this happen?" I explained everything, how Jake had begged for money, how he'd stolen from my investment account, and how he'd been lying to everyone about his financial situation. By the time I was done, my mom was in tears, and my dad looked like he was ready to drive to Jake's apartment and wring his neck. "I thought we raised him better than this," my dad muttered, shaking his head. "You did," I said. "But he made his choices, and now he has to deal with the consequences." That night, my parents called Jake and confronted him. I wasn't there to hear the conversation, but judging by the string of angry texts I got from Jake afterward, it didn't go well for him. "You had no right to tell them," he wrote. "You're trying to ruin my life." I didn't bother responding. He wasn't wrong, I was trying to ruin his life. But only because he'd ruined mine first. By now, Jake's world was falling apart, but I still wasn't satisfied. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his actions, to lose not just his money but his pride, his comfort, and his sense of control. I wanted him to understand that betrayal has consequences, and that he'd picked the wrong person to betray. I didn't hear from Jake for a few weeks after the blow-up with our parents. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. I knew him too well, he wasn't the type to let things go. He was probably stewing in his apartment, trying to figure out how to spin the situation in his favor. Jake always thought he was the smartest guy in the room, but this time, he was dealing with someone who knew him better than he knew himself. Meanwhile, my own plans were still in motion. The bank investigation wrapped up sooner than expected, and they refunded the $20,000 Jake had stolen. But they also informed me that the police had officially opened a case against him. They didn't take these kinds of financial crimes lightly, even if it was between siblings. A part of me felt a pang of guilt. Was I really ready to send my own brother down this road? But that guilt was nothing compared to the anger and betrayal I still felt. Then I got the text. "Meet me at the Den at 7. We need to talk." The Den was Jake's favorite dive bar, the kind of place where the lights were so dim you could barely see your drink, and the music was just loud enough to drown out any serious conversations. I debated whether or not to go. I knew whatever Jake had to say wouldn't be an apology, not a real one, anyway. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see him squirm. When I walked into the bar, Jake was already there, nursing a beer at the corner table. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes, his hair unkempt, and his usually cocky demeanor replaced by something almost nervous. "Ethan," he said, nodding as I sat down across from him. "Jake." For a moment, neither of us said anything. I waited, letting the awkward silence stretch between us. Jake hated silence, it made him uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward. "Look, I messed up, okay? I shouldn't have taken your money. I get that." I raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't have. That's it. That's the big apology." He groaned, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want me to say, Ethan?" "I'm sorry, all right?" I was desperate. Desperate? For what? Another gambling spree? A new toy to impress your friends? Give me a break, Jake. You didn't steal from me because you were desperate, you stole from me because you thought you could get away with it. He flinched at my words but didn't deny them. Instead, he took a long sip of his beer, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for an escape. "I'm trying to make it right," he said finally. "I'll pay you back. I need some time." I laughed bitterly. "Time? Jake, you've been saying that since you borrowed $5,000 from me a year ago. You don't need time, you need a reality check." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. But instead, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. It was the same smirk he used to wear when he thought he'd outsmarted someone. "You know, you're not perfect either," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think you're so much better than me because you've got a steady job and a savings account. But let's not forget who used to cover for you when you were too scared to stand up for yourself." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't let him see that he'd struck a nerve. This isn't about the past, Jake. This is about what you did. You betrayed me. You stole from me. And instead of owning up to it, you acted like it was no big deal. For the first time, the smirk faltered. Jake stared at me, his face a mix of anger and something else, something like fear. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice quieter now. I don't have the money. You know that. So what's the point? You want me to grovel? Fine. I'm sorry. I messed up. There. Happy? I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm and steady. What I want, Jake, is for you to take responsibility for your actions. For once in your life, stop blaming everyone else and face the consequences of what you've done. He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at his drink, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. The silence between us stretched again, and this time, I didn't wait for him to break it. I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table to cover my drink. Good luck, Jake, I said, my tone cold. You're going to need it. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, relief, and something close to pity. Jake had always been the charming one, the one who could talk his way out of anything. But now, for the first time, he was facing a problem he couldn't charm his way out of. And I wasn't going to save him. The fallout came fast after that. A week later, Jake was served papers for a court date. He called me in a panic, begging me to drop the charges. Ethan, come on, man. This is going to ruin me. That's not my problem, Jake, I said, my voice cold. You should have thought about that before you stole from me. But we're family. How can you do this to me? I laughed, the sound bitter in my ears. Family? Don't even try to play that card. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and expect to get away with it. You made your bed, Jake. Now you get to lie in it. He kept calling, leaving voicemails filled with anger, desperation, and increasingly weak attempts at guilt-tripping me. I ignored them all. I was done letting him manipulate me. When the court date finally came, Jake showed up looking like a shadow of his former self. His once pristine appearance was gone, replaced by a cheap suit that didn't fit and a defeated slump in his shoulders. He tried to argue that it had all been a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too damning. The bank records, the emails, the IP address, it was all there, laid out in black and white. In the end, the judge ruled against him. Jake was ordered to repay the $20,000 in full, plus court fees. And since he couldn't come up with the money, his wages were garnished. It wasn't jail, but it was enough to knock him off the pedestal he'd built for himself. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I'd feel satisfied, maybe even vindicated. But as I walked out of the courtroom that day, I felt hollow. Jake had gotten what he deserved, but it didn't bring back the trust he'd broken. It didn't erase the betrayal. Still, I reminded myself that this was his doing, not mine. He'd made his choices, and he was finally facing the consequences. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was free of him. Life slowly returned to normal after the court ruling. Jake's wages were garnished, and the money he owed me trickled back in small, unsatisfying payments over the next year. I didn't bother to check in on him, I had no desire to see how he was doing. To me, he was out of my life, and I was better off for it. But then, a year later, something happened that pulled me right back into Jake's chaos. It started with a phone call from an unknown number late one evening. Normally, I wouldn't have picked up, but for some reason, I did. Ethan, the voice on the other end said. It was shaky, almost breathless. Who is this? I asked. It's Jake. I froze. I hadn't heard from him in over a year, not since the court case. I thought he'd finally gotten the message to stay out of my life. What do you want? I asked coldly. Listen to me, he said, his voice trembling. I need your help. I'm in trouble. Big trouble. I almost laughed. You think I'm going to help you after everything you did to me? Forget it. This isn't like before, he pleaded. It's serious. If you don't help me, I'm dead. The desperation in his voice stopped me short. As much as I hated Jake for what he'd done, I couldn't ignore the sheer panic coming through the phone. What kind of trouble? I asked reluctantly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he whispered, I got involved with some people. Bad people. I owe them money, more money than I can pay. They said if I don't come up with it by Friday, he trailed off, but I didn't need him to finish. I rubbed my temples, my frustration boiling over. So, what? You think I'm going to bail you out? Again? You don't understand, Jake said quickly. These guys don't play around. They'll kill me, Ethan. I know I don't deserve your help, but you're the only person I can turn to. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to tell him to deal with the consequences of his actions, just like I had before. But something about the fear in his voice made me hesitate. This wasn't like the last time, this wasn't just him being irresponsible or careless. This was life or death. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. When I saw Jake in person, I barely recognized him. He looked gaunt, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes were bloodshot. Whatever trouble he was in, it was eating him alive. He told me everything over coffee at a dingy diner on the edge of town. After the court case, he tried to get his life together, but the debt had been too much to handle. That's when he turned to a local loan shark, someone who didn't ask questions as long as you paid on time. Jake had borrowed $30,000, promising to pay it back in 3 months. Of course, he didn't. They've been coming after me for weeks, Jake said, his hands shaking as he gripped his coffee cup. They said if I don't pay by Friday, they're going to make an example out of me. How much do you owe now? I asked, already dreading the answer. 50 grand, he whispered. I let out a low whistle. Jake, that's insane. Even if I wanted to help you, which I don't have that kind of money. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I'm not asking you for the money. I need you to help me figure out what to do. I sat back, crossing my arms. You're asking for a miracle, Jake. And honestly, after everything you've done, why should I care? He looked up at me, his eyes glistening with tears. Because I'm your brother. That word, brother, hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything, part of me still remembered the Jake I used to look up to, the Jake who had been my best friend. I hated that I still cared, but I did. Fine, I said finally. I'll help you. But this is the last time, Jake. If you screw this up, you're on your own. Over the next few days, I did everything I could to come up with a solution. I reached out to some old contacts, hoping to find someone who could negotiate with the loan shark. But no one wanted to get involved. These were dangerous people, and no one was willing to stick their neck out for Jake. By Thursday night, we were out of options. Jake was a wreck, pacing around my condo like a caged animal. What are we going to do? He kept asking, his voice rising with panic. We're not doing anything, I snapped. You're going to meet with them tomorrow, explain the situation, and hope they're willing to give you more time. And if they're not? I didn't have an answer for that. The next day, Jake left to meet the loan shark, and I stayed behind, waiting anxiously by the phone. Hours passed with no word. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Finally, around midnight, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 men were standing there, large, intimidating, and stone-faced. Between them, they held Jake, who looked like he'd been through hell. His face was bruised, his lip was split, and he was barely conscious. You his brother? One of the men asked. I nodded, my stomach sinking. He's your problem now, the man said, shoving Jake into my arms. Tell him he's got 1 week to come up with the money. After that, we won't be so nice. Before I could respond, they turned and walked away. I dragged Jake inside, laying him on the couch. He groaned in pain, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. You're an idiot, I muttered, grabbing a towel to clean the blood off his face. Thanks, he croaked, his voice barely audible. For the next few days, Jake stayed at my place while I tried to figure out what to do. I hated him for dragging me into this, but I couldn't just abandon him. Then, one night, as I was going through his phone to look for clues about the loan shark, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. It was an email chain, messages between Jake and someone I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was just spam, but as I read through the conversation, my blood ran cold. The emails detailed a plan, Jake's plan. He had orchestrated the entire thing. The loan shark, the threats, even the beating, it was all fake. A setup to manipulate me into bailing him out one last time. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages, piecing together the timeline. Jake had never been in danger. He'd faked the whole thing, right down to the bruises on his face. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother denying it. All right, fine, he said, his tone defiant. I needed the money, okay? You wouldn't have helped me otherwise. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the depths of his betrayal. You're unbelievable, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You lied to me, again. You put me through hell, again. For what? Money? Jake shrugged, his expression unapologetic. It's not like you were using it. I didn't say another word. I walked into my room, grabbed my phone, and called the police. When they showed up to arrest him, Jake looked at me with disbelief. You're really doing this? He asked as they cuffed him. You're not my brother anymore, I said coldly. Not after this. As they dragged him away, I felt a strange sense of relief. Jake had finally pushed me too far, and I was done. This time, there was no going back.